be talking about responsive design. If you do not like animated GIFs, you are in the wrong room. That's just, straight up. So, responsive design, I feel like I've been talking about it for 3 years, and I feel like in 3 years, not a lot has changed in the last year maybe. So we're going to talk about some workflow and some kind of process stuff and all that stuff we love to talk about and how it goes. So, this day and age, we live in a world of devices. Everyone has a phone, everyone has a tablet. Sometimes they come up with a really nice name, a phablet, or worst name ever for a device. Also, that form factor of holding that, at what point does your hand just get super cramped and then you're walking around like this the entire time? But you see this. But, going back to devices, and we are starting to think a little bit more about devices, we are at that point when we're doing web development now that we have to target everything, and we have to be everything to everyone, and it's this really, really hard thing to do. So, how many people here have been doing responsive design, right, in some form or another, almost like the entire room, And so it's one of those things where it doesn't really matter anymore what you're designing for, because it could be on a phone, it could be on a tablet. You could go and buy the new stuff that's coming out for the TV from Amazon. It could be on a TV. Browsers are everywhere. And if you're not scared of that, it's, I don't know what you're doing right. I'd love to know, because to me it's a really scary thing. You have no idea who's going to be on what or where. I went home at Christmas, spent some time with my family, as we all do, right? And we all become tech support, right? Everyone loves that shit. Your dad's like, why all the pop-up windows? Dad, I wonder. I know what you're doing, right? Not even gonna go into details about that one. Fix it, whatever. But, in the meantime, I upgraded everyone's, OS across the board. I upgraded everyone's browser. I did a solid for the web community that day, right? Everyone owes me, because my parents are now completely updated, and it scares the shit out of them, So, when we start to think about those things, you have no idea where people are going to be. And so, when you have way more devices and way more form factors and the fluidity of it all, you kind of get into that whole thing that we're going to have more problems, right? And they're going to be unexpected ones, right? Things that you don't really anticipate, nor can you test for. So, people at the back, you can come in if you want. I'll embrace you. So you start to think about those things, right? And you're just like, okay, it's not anything that's going to change. Device fragmentation across the board is just going to be what we're dealing with. And personally, I enjoy it. I like the fact that I can go and have this phone or have this device and all these things and content across the board. But it does make it difficult on us. And it makes it difficult not just for a developer or a designer, but just as an overall industry and figuring out how to kind of scope those things, right? So one of the problems I have with responsive design right now is the definition. And when you say responsive design, it means so many things to so many people. And some people will be like, oh, it's just, purely, it's a layout thing, right? Some people will be like, well, it's layout, it's a little bit of behavior, it's this, it's that. And the problem is that it's really vague. You get a client who comes in and they're like, I want a responsive site, and that should scare you. As soon as a client is telling you exactly how you're going to approach something, that becomes worrisome, right? And so the problem is it's super, super vague, right, across the board. And it means so many things to so many people. And so when we think about responsive design, we can think about your content should fill the space given, right? Hopefully nicely, right? And sometimes our content should fit anywhere. It can be small, it can be big. It should, look good, perform well across the board. And then sometimes that becomes hard with the content that you've been given, right? And so I like to call that digital muffin top. And it's when you have so much crap to put into a page that just won't fit it, right? And so everyone starts freaking out because they're like, I don't know what is meant by this anymore. I just know that it should work anywhere that I look at it. But no one thinks about the details around it. No one thinks about Are you optimizing versus just, targeting? No one thinks about all these details. And so responsive design in some ways, I mean, we've been doing it for a long time. Like a fluid table is responsive design, like lazy styles, right? Like this guy, right? Or it can be super complex. You could be doing all sorts of like feature detection and loading stuff for that, kind of thing, and across the board. So it can be really simple and it can be really complex, and it's really up to you when you're working with someone to define what you're doing, right? You can't go in a team environment on the assumption that it's just going to work, because what works for you might not work for someone else, and that whole kind of varying definition is what's going to get you in trouble. So we kind of have an idea of what responsive design is. It's about making sure the content looks good no matter where it is. A lot of people just love to resize the browser 100 million times, and they think that's responsive design, right? And the one thing that we do know right now is that it's far from perfect, right? We're all trying to work this out. And we're trying to figure out how can we make this process streamlined? How can we really, use this process and do it in a way that's going to make sense? But the problem is that we all deal with clients, right? So how many people here do client work, right? Even if you do product, you still have a client. You're still, basically responding to someone who wants something, right? And the problem with clients is sometimes we have to spend a lot of time educating them, right? And so I actually did this the other day. I was like in the browser, I was looking at something, I tried to click it, and it was an image, and I didn't understand why it wasn't working. And then I was like, oh, I'm a client, I get it, right? But, we have to kind of, it's our responsibility as web developers or designers to educate the client and to kind of walk them through what it is and what it isn't. Even if they really do ask for some things, it just makes you want to slap them, right? And the biggest thing about responsive design, I can say right now, no matter what you're doing that works or doesn't work right now, is it really does require a mind shift, right? And some of the things that you're required to do in these new kind of processes blow some people's minds, right? And when I say some people's, I'm usually talking about designers right now, because I feel like for developers, it's a new technology, you're trying it out, but I feel like for designers specifically, this is where it's becoming a little bit problematic, because you're starting to feel like, what am I doing right now, here, how, right? And so when we start to talk about deliverables, right, like things that you give to the client, things that are required, right? We have to think about these deliverables. We get in the cycle when we're working with the client, and we're used to working with static comps, right? So we give the client 3 options. That's what you always hear. You give them 3 options. One you love, one you hate, and one you can live with, right? Everyone always talks about these 3 comps. I'm going to mock up the site, show you the front page, show you all these things. And so, we give the client these choices. They kind of weigh over the choices. They look at the comps. They're trying to figure out which it is. And we start off with a PSD that maybe looks like this. Client comes back, you have 3 revisions, next thing you fucking know, it looks like this, right? Kudos to the girl on Twitter who gave this to me. Like, that's layer 344 unnamed. That's some serious shit, right? She's like, yeah, I'll be a bad example, here you go. And I was like, holy amazing, right? But a couple revisions later, and you're here. And so the problem, I think, for a lot of designers right now is that you're trying to figure out, okay, like we can't do this process. This process no longer makes sense, right? Opening up Photoshop, doing a comp, doing the front page, doing a landing page, doing a login flow or something, and then going, oh, okay, well this looks great on a big screen. Now what is it going to be like in mobile? I got to go mock those up. It's completely unrealistic, right? And so people have been saying for a while, get in the browser, hurry up and get in the browser, right? Like, stop spending your time in Photoshop and get back in the browser. And so people were saying, Photoshop's dead. No one's using Photoshop. Please, how many people here are designers, right? Photoshop Photoshop, for a lot of you, Photoshop or Illustrator or whatever tool of your choice, that's like your sketch, your place to go and sketch. It's like your tools that you use that are very comfortable, much like I feel very comfortable opening up Sublime or Visual Studio or something like that. That's where you work. That's, why would I want to take that away from you? It just means that you need to use the tool a little bit different. And so this is where the whole problem with responsive design is right now, is because you've got to do a mind shift, and it's got to start internally and also reach externally to the client. And so Photoshop is really good for sitting and trying to mock up overall the components and things that you're going to kind of work with, right? But as a deliverable, Photoshop really is starting not to make as much sense anymore. And the problem with that is that we still kind of lean towards that. And it's hard to kind of pull back on a client and be like, you're not going to see our vision of what it's going to look like right away. You're going to see it as a work in progress. And a work in progress is scary shit, right? Because you're like, you might post something, it might be half broken, you might be toying with how things work or look, you're figuring it out as you go along. Who wants to be that transparent with the client? And we're at the point where you almost need to be, right? And so you're starting to get into things where little steps are being made to get out of Photoshop and into the browser. And a good example of one of those is, has anyone heard of the Parfait from Adobe? Just came out. So one of the problems of Photoshop, you go as a designer, you mock it up, use these fonts, use these colors, awesome, looks beautiful, wicked. Hand it off to a developer, developer's like, whatever. Like, how the hell do I get all the information I need? I just want the styles out of it, right? Just give me all the points, all the fonts, all the colors, give me the margins, basically kind of mock that or spec that out for me. And there's been tools across the board that have come into play. And this is a new one. Upload your PSD, it'll go through, it'll parse it for you, and it's, once again, trying to bridge that, that kind of shift that we're doing right now, because not everyone's ready to let go of Photoshop and, just open up a web page and start coding, for example. And nor should anyone have to do that. Like, designers shouldn't have to feel like they have to learn a lot of code. It's probably going there, to be honest. But, use the tools that you are really good at and you want to use. So you're starting to see these things like this that are bridging it. You're starting to see things like typecast. How many people have used typecast at all? It's amazing. You type in, it renders the fonts exactly how you'll see them. You can start to play with all the different properties. It's amazing. If you haven't started using it, use it, because the problem with, especially with fonts, is that we all know, right, that fonts render different on different OSs, because, different font rendering machines and all the rest of that, right? Different browsers also, depending on what you're doing. We all know there's different hacks for those kind of things. And usually if you're in Photoshop and you're using some of those fonts, you make that static comp, those fonts aren't going to look exactly just like that in the browser, right? Number one problem I've had in the last 2 years has been fonts with clients, because it looks really good if someone mocks it up. You get it in the browser, you play with it, you tweak it, you get as close as you can, but it's not always exactly what you see there, right? So something like this, there's tools like this that are starting to come out. You're starting to see, tools like Mulcahy that comes out and is basically, creates the HTML for you, creates the CSS from you, and lets you kind of use it as a visual editor, right? So all these tools are starting to come out very designer-oriented. When you look at all this stuff, it's not developer-oriented, it's designer-oriented. And because that's where a lot of the problems are coming into play right now. Whew. I feel like I just went on a run. All right. Sorry, I did actually go on a run this morning and accidentally joined a 5K. True story. They were very confused when I left and I was going the wrong way, and there was a couple people like, she's going the wrong way. And I'm like, oh, whatever. Anyways, little aside, welcome. Aesthetics aside, content is still king, right? And when we talk about responsive design, you no longer can say, I'll just, use some lorem ipsum or write some dumb content in there or put in some kitty pictures or whatever you want to do. It's really important, more than ever now, that you actually get the content that you are going to be using ahead of time. The reason for that is because you've got to start thinking about things like content hierarchy and where are things going to be placed and the importance of them. And if you just put in placeholder information, it no longer makes sense, and you can't, give the right solution for what you're trying to present. Now remember, you're, responsive design, you're trying to make one solution that fits across the board generally. That's where you start. So content's super important. And so when you start thinking about content hierarchy, you know, people are going back to basics almost. It's really interesting talking to a lot of people who are, you know, giving deliverables to clients. Like, I saw someone who, really well-respected designer in the industry, and he was showing me a content hierarchy doc, and it was just literally like a table of contents. And I was like, oh, that's so simple, and so like, how doesn't a client look at that and think, what? And people are going back to basics, right? And so you're starting to see something like a priority guide. Has anyone heard of like a priority guide? It's where you kind of like look at your content, you start just, you know, figuring out which ones have priority, right? Because we all know when you're doing responsive design, you have your layouts and your columns. You know, priority might make sense in the big screen, but if you make it smaller, things might fold underneath. And so this might have had priority up here, but now it's way down here and you gotta scroll. So you need to figure out the priority and if you need to adjust that, right? You're starting to see things like style tiles. Has anyone heard of style tiles? I feel like they're way more popular. It's basically like a mood board almost, right? But this is becoming, some of these things are becoming replacements for PSDs and for static comps. And so style tiles, a couple examples, you know, they give a sense of just the overall styles. It's like a branding guide almost, you know? Just, I'm giving you the colors, I'm giving you the elements, I'm giving you the fonts, you know? And I'm not mocking up this entire website for you. And so there's a bunch of examples, you know, you can start to see how people are doing them. And if you go to Dribbble or Behance, you'll see a lot of people posting like what they're doing here. But once again, you're not seeing it necessarily as a page, you're just seeing components and how those visual elements come together, right? And so this is something that people are handing off to clients and being like, these are the overall styles, you know? Like, we're not gonna get into me doing a custom page for you right now, we're just talking about styles. And so a lot of people have had really good success with this. And then you can take it a step further, and there's element collages, and this is something that Daniel Mull has kind of blogged about. And the problem with style tiles, let's face it, you know, or even those kind of basic things, is that when you're doing that, you know, they're not in context. It's like, here's what a button might look like, and here's what a paragraph might look like, but people want to understand the overall picture, right? So they're not really in context. So when you have some elements that are really grouped together, you're starting to see things like this that are like element collages. And so you're saying, this is how it's going to work and look like all together in a unit, right? So I might have a button and a video player and something else, and I'm kind of just giving you a sense of what those elements are going to look like. Daniel Mull, a great reference for this kind of stuff, all right? And then you got to think about things like a style guide, or people call it a pattern library, right? So a lot of us have read through, you know, amazing branding guides. Basically, a style guide or pattern library is almost like that, and it's almost one step further. It's like documentation of all your work, and pretty much more developer-oriented. So you'll tend to see these things, and it'll like kind of dictate, you know, what a little module might look like, so what a video player might look like, what the code might be, what the styles are, like those kind of things. When we were at Big Spaceship, we worked on Star Wars. This is one of our deliverables, was the style guide, because we had to hand off everything we did. We did all the templates and the front end stuff, and we had to hand it off, so if they were gonna make a new page, they just knew to copy and paste and, you know, basically Lego that shit together and it's gonna work, right? I didn't say Lego that shit, though. I don't think Star Wars will like that. But, you know, things like that. So you're starting to see things, and there's tools to help you make those things, right? So like Hologram is a tool that helps you kind of make a basic style guide. You know, and something that you can hand off again as a deliverable, right? So deliverables are changing across the board, even into working prototypes. So how many people here are actively prototyping, right? Yeah, how many people think they should be prototyping but aren't? Yeah, we should probably almost all have our hands up, right? Because when you think about prototyping, whether it's coding or whether it's just design, you know, you're in Photoshop, you're working out an idea, you kind of make a comp, whatever, not sure, you leave it there and you start a new one, you do something else, that's prototyping, right? Like you're just making a one-off that might work, it might not. Code-wise, we need to be doing a lot more of that, because when you're prototyping and you're showing people something earlier, you can, you know, get their input and their feedback, and they get the context that it's intended. The problem with static comps right now is that you have this visual and no one understands what the interaction design is going to be around it, even if you mock it up or do an animatic, right? So a working prototype gives a person that sense of how it's going to look. And how do you kind of suggest what a hover is going to look like, or those kind of things. So working prototypes are super important. As a developer, just write some HTML and toss in some JavaScript or whatever you need to do to get it working and running and up. As a designer, once again, there's a bunch of tools that are out there that literally allow you to almost drag and drop, right? And these are things that, when it comes to prototyping is a really hard discussion to have, because prototyping has that kind of sense that we're going to make something and toss it out, right? It's garbage. It's just we're trying something and it's never going to be used. That's what people think when we talk about actively prototyping. What client wants to pay for that, right? Like, there's no line item that says like prototyping, may toss out, right? No client wants to pay for that. But this is kind of actual R&D stuff that you need to be doing. And so as a designer, there's a bunch of tools out there that you can start to use. There's Marvel app. Once again, these are all aimed towards designers, and they're all like, no coding required. Don't worry, it's just going to work, right? And so, it's the idea of taking any of those kind of sketches or wireframes and just quickly seeing if it's going to work. And that becomes really important in responsive design, because if you mock up on a big screen, what works in a small screen might not, translate. Big modal boxes, complex drop-downs, those kind of things don't work in a smaller context, right? And so, you're starting to see all these kind of tools. This is Webflow. It's basically uses like CSS regions. You can just go, regions. You can go in and edit stuff and add stuff and drag and drop. Allows you to do it very quickly. And once again, you might never use the stuff out of this, but it at least basically allows you a tool as a designer to communicate to your developers like how you want something to work, right? And so you're starting to see a lot of these kind of things. Once again, another one, Envision, and you're seeing prototyping, collaboration, and workflow for designers all across the board. Has anyone used any of these kind of tools out there? Yeah, a couple of people, right? I mean, I've played with a couple of them, and they're good to get up and running. For me, prototyping, I go in and I just stub out some HTML and just add some CSS as quick as I can. So it really depends on how you like to work, right? And prototyping doesn't have to look like this either. Prototyping can be paper prototyping. Use some sticky notes, put things down, start moving them around. I'll show you an example later of something that I did with Daniel Mall on a project, and it was another way of prototyping, right? So we talk about approaches, and whatever. Merry Christmas. It's probably April and we still got their tree up. Approaches, things that you've got to really take with you when you're doing responsive design that are really important to, kind of consider. And one of them is the idea of a page. You need to basically get rid of the idea of a page, right? And this is a really hard one for most people to kind of wrap their head around. Because when we comp up stuff right now, we do the front page, right? We'll do a landing page, an interior page. We might, do something that has all the error states, whatever it may be, like, 3 or 4 pages. We talk in pages. And there's a reason why we talk in pages, because it provides context. But in order to kind of do responsive design in the way that it is right now, it's better if you think about design systems rather than pages. And so what that means is you need to kind of step back and you need to say, okay, we're not going to talk about the home page. We're not going to talk about the interior page. We're going to talk about all the things that might potentially make up those pages. Okay, and I'm going to go through a couple of the ideas around there. Now, one thing to note here is that a lot of people, they talk about this kind of approach and design systems and all those things, thinking about things as units, right, and then building them up. And it's a big kind of mind shift from where we came from. We're so used to mocking up the entire thing. It is also kind of the reason why, and a lot of people might hate me in the room for saying this, so whatever, here we go. But it's also the reason why a lot of sites kind of look the same right now. I don't know if any of you feel that way, but everything kind of looks like someone just puked out Bootstrap, right? Like, whoa, colored it, done, right? And, or that, things are starting to kind of, be standardized. And, we think about this in terms of responsive design, but, you gotta step it back a little bit. And our industry kind of does that, right? We do very, very utility. We figure out the technology, and then we push it as far as we can to the other side. And it becomes sometimes unusable, you know, a little crazy, experiential, whatever you want to call it. And then we try to find this middle ground, right? And so you can just go back and think about all the sites you've seen in the last 10 years and how that's happened, right? You know, so there is a reason why things do kind of look very similar right now. Like the same person did a lot of the same sites. And it's because we're, you know, trying to figure out those best practices and those approaches. And that's one of the other things that becomes problematic right now is that how many people love the experiential sites like Snowfall, for example, where you're like scrolling and it's like the new journalism or whatever kind of bullshit phrase they gave it, right? So, you know, those sites are beautiful, right? And they're awesome. I love those sites. Like, I actually like sites that are, I don't ever want to see another parallax site again, ever. And I also don't ever want anyone to reference Tinder in terms of like interaction. Like, hey, it's Groupon for Tinder, or it's Tinder for whatever. Shut up, I don't want to hear that. But I love those sites, and I love that they exist. But I also know how much time goes into that kind of site, right? I was reading this thing about Tihan and Wax, you know, beautiful work. And they spend a lot of time on their case studies, right? And case studies are beautiful. But that's like a lot of people over a long period of time to get this case study to look as beautiful as it is with all the bells and whistles, right? So that's a really hard sell, you know, for example, to a client. Like, oh, we can create the site, but it's not going to work here, here, and here, and, you know, it's got all the bells and whistles. So bringing that back again, there's a reason why those things are kind of looking that way, and I think we're kind of progressing and trying to work it out. And so you got to kind of think small, right? And instead of thinking of a page, you want to think smaller units. And so you have something, atomic design, for example, from Brad Frost. How many people have heard of atomic design? Right? How many people have heard of Brad Frost? Everyone. Yeah, right? Amazing, amazing speaker, and amazing just ideas and approaches around how we should be doing things. And so, you know, when you start thinking about atomic design, it's talking about the smallest units and then putting them together. So treating things like building blocks and Legos. So you're thinking about the smallest unit in a page might be a paragraph, it might be a heading, it might be a button, right? And then you start to think about it in context, and you start to build it out a little bit. And so you're starting to think about all those kind of things, whether it's atoms, molecules, you know, and a whole framework around how we think about those things, right? So you're creating reusable elements that are going to be used again and again and again throughout the pages. And then what you're doing is you're kind of mixing and matching, right? So you have all of your blocks, you create your blocks, and then you start to build buildings out of your blocks, right? And so we start to think about these things in terms of components, right? I love this picture of Obama. Like, I'm just so confused by this. There's so many captions. I think the one that they had was like, you didn't build this. But you've got to think about components. So if we just even look at the picture, you start to see all these little things brought together and it created a building here, right? And so that's how we need to think about these things. And so we got to embrace, you know, being modular. And modular is not just about creating a little button. It's not just about creating a navigation. Just being modular is a sense of, I'm going to create these things in units so that I can just kind of plug and play, right? And that's kind of where people are going right now with a lot of this stuff. And so a module, if you're thinking about a unit or a module, it might have HTML, it might have CSS, right? And it might have JavaScript. And it's all scoped to that module. So there's a bunch of things around, you know, modules, whether you're going to JavaScript and you're using something like wire.js, whether you're going to CSS and you're using Jonathan Snook's Smacks, right? Whether, you know, you're creating that HTML in a way that you're scoping it properly, modules are like a big way that people are going. You no longer sit down and write the whole HTML page out. You actually go and just write that list, or you just make that navigation, and then you start to just put them in together. One thing I kind of want to show you guys, and it was like, this was my first responsive project. I came from Flash. I'm okay admitting it. I love Flash. Flash is the shit. I don't care. I still think it's the shit. I don't work in it anymore, but I still like it. But one of the first projects, I was really lucky. I got to work with Daniel Mall, who's like amazing, amazing designer and developer. Like, the guy's disgusting, right? It's one of those people you just want to slap. You're just like, you're so talented, this is wrong. And we were working on Crayola. So Crayola, yay! I still kind of, oh, every time I see crayons, I'm like, oh. You know that when you work on a client for so long, you're just like, I can't, like, I don't want to see them? I get that a little. But first project I worked on, and he taught me so much. And one of the things that we did is that we were redoing their entire .com. And when I say their current .com was kind of all over the place, it was like all over the place. It was like there were leaks and holes and people were duct taping shit all over the place on that site, right? And they knew it because they were, you know, building out new little things. And how do you do it? Your current, you know, architecture doesn't support it, so you're just going to jam it in somewhere, right? Very natural thing for .coms to do and for it to happen. So we were redoing the .com, and really amazing opportunity and an amazing client. But we were struggling with like how do we approach it, because they really, I wouldn't say them, we were working also with a third party who was doing the back end, and they wanted a sense of how many pages and templates and how do these things work together. And we were trying to explain this idea of building components. Like, we don't care about that stuff. We're just going to build you components, and they're just going to work. They're just going to go together, you know? And so we started to actually create a document, and we didn't give them wireframes. Like, we started to kind of, you know, show maybe like layouts, but we didn't, you know, specifically say what exactly was going to be on the page. And we gave them components. And so we had, you know, for example, we had a grid that had item renderers, and every single item renderer we kind of like mocked up what it would have. We had the video player, we had the carousel. Of course, everyone wants a carousel, no one wants to click it, right? It's funny because it's true. But, you know, all those things we started outlining, right? And we gave them that, and it was like they did not know what to do with it, right? And so it took us a while. How do we work this out? And it was awesome because they're like, I get it. Okay, so for our back end, we can just, you know, we can create a custom page if we want to. We just need to customize these components, and then we can add a little bit of, you know, extra if we need to. And so that's how we kind of worked with that. And it was, at the time, I don't think anything was written about that or really like talked too much about how that approach was being dealt with in terms of responsive design. But it was awesome. And then we gave them like a style guide at the end that had a link to every single component, and they could click it, they could see it in all the, you know, all the scales and all that kind of thing, and all the sizes. And it was also documented. They could just copy and paste. And it was probably the first time I'd worked on a project, well, first time I'd ever worked on a project like that, but it was the first time I worked on a project I was like, this works. Like, I believe this works. And so, you know, doing something like that, how many people here wireframe? Like, it almost makes no sense in terms of responsive design nowadays for some things, because you can almost get away just by doing components and modules, right? For other complex workflows, you've got a wireframe, but, you know, you're starting to see less and less wireframing. So, you know, one of those kind of things like this totally worked for us. Breakpoints, right? Responsive design, we know that one of the major things about responsive design is breakpoints, right? At what point can you write CSS for certain breakpoints? And the problem is that devices for a long time have been dictating breakpoints. All the early grid systems, if you looked at them, it's you know, all aimed towards the iPad, right? All their sizes, 760, 9, whatever, they're all aimed towards device, a specific device. Number one way to be successful with responsive design is to be device agnostic. Don't care about it. Don't care about your device. Just care about your content. Let your content drive everything. So when it comes to breakpoints, you're still going to probably have these standard breakpoints, but instead of being like, I need to target a device, let your content decide. Work with the browser. Rescale. And if it looks like it needs to be tweaked, tweak it. Put in a breakpoint. Figure it out. You know, put in a query and add some stuff. Don't necessarily let devices define that, right? And so you don't need to worry about landscape and portrait and this and this and this for tablet. You start to just see where your content needs it, right? And that's the beauty of just the fluidity of those kind of things. It also means that if you're into pixel perfection, you gotta let go a little, right? I know it's hard, but it's not the place to be pixel pushing at all, right? So we're going to talk just a little bit about expectations too. And expectations is a really, really hard one Because when it comes to expectations, everyone has different expectations of how something should be or how it should work. One of the biggest problems I've found in the last 2 years has been, how do you define what browsers you're testing versus what browsers you're targeting, right? And so, you want to build a really great site that looks great across the board, and all of a sudden you've got some weird spec in like IE8 or something. It's okay, I work for Windows. I know IE8's not fun, right? Like, come on, I see that and I cry a little. But, you get that. And sometimes what happens when you're working with a client is that you don't have the choice, because what you're doing is you're looking at their analytics for their current site, and if there's a lot of people using IE6, guess what? You might have to support that, Or if they're all using modern browsers, yay, less work. But targeting and testing are two different things, because you can't have every friggin' device, right? Like, you can't be like, I have an iPad, this generation with this OS that hasn't been updated, that has this version of Safari. You can't do that. It becomes really unrealistic, right? And so you start to figure out what browsers you're actually going to support and you're going to optimize for, meaning like, where is the experience going to be great versus where are the other ones where they're outliers? And what does that mean in terms of your contract, right? So Brad Frost, he sent me an email, it was great. He was like calling it graded browser support. And he had his definition of what that meant. And I kind of distilled it down into this. Here's the browsers it's gonna work in. Here's the browsers I'm assuming it should work, right? We all know this one because you don't have those devices, you can't test them. Gonna work here because I'm gonna test them. Should work here, right? And then these aren't gonna work. Like, this is more work. And that's where you become, figuring out how you kind of talk to clients about that. Most people, when they're doing browsers, they say current browser -1. Like, that's how you kind of say a modern browser, right? And so now you've got to figure out what happens if your client happens to be on, and this is a true story, Windows XP, doesn't have clear type turned on, is seeing problems in their IE whatever that's not anywhere in your contract specs, right? So that way, if you start kind of outlining your browsers that way, you know exactly what the expectations are. Like, these are the ones we're going to cover. So, Firefox, latest version of IE, Chrome, mobile, go across the board. Don't ever list devices. And then here's the ones that should work. And then here's, the ones that require more work. So, best practices. This is what you guys have been sitting here waiting for. Best practices. Give me the best practices. There really are none. Sorry. Right? We're still learning stuff. And we're stumbling a little as we learn, right? And it's natural and it's going to happen, right? And so the only best practice I can offer anyone is, figure out your browsers and how you're going to build up, but also kind of try to figure out a way to discover workflow efficiencies. So if you're writing CSS, consider using preprocessors, right? I think there's a whole talk on preprocessors. How many people use a preprocessor, right? Like SAS or LESS or whatever. I mean, once you start using them, you can't go back, right? They're beautiful. So once again, it's a workflow efficiency. Figuring out a way to get out of the PSD and into the browser quickly. Workflow efficiency, right? How many people use something like Grunt or Gulp or any of those kind of build systems, right? Okay. Get converted if you haven't. They're amazing. Grunt has so many plugins just aimed towards responsive design. So start figuring out those kind of workflow efficiencies, and that's probably the best advice I can kind of give you in that realm. Now, things aren't going to change. We're just going to have more browsers, more devices, some of them more ridiculous than others. So you've got to just figure out the best way to do it and be device agnostic, focus on your content. And kind of take those things from it. That's all I got. So thank you. We have a couple minutes, so if anyone has, which is really weird for me, usually I just like talk the whole way through, and I really have to pee. But if you want to ask me any questions, just come find me and we can chat. I'd love to hear what people are doing and what's working for them. Thank you.